So we started by talking about the structure and function of individual neurons and how a single neuron is designed to receive, process, and send information. We've talked about how neurons communicate with each other through chemical messengers of neurotransmitters, and how the fact that that information is a chemical messenger can actually create miscommunication between neurons, and our discussion of drugs and their effect on the brain. Now we're going to talk about how the nervous system as a whole is organized. No longer just one or handful of neurons, but large groups of neurons, sometimes millions or even billions of neurons organized together structurally in our body, and the kinds of functions that are produced by them. As we explore the anatomy of the nervous system, though, we have to be able to have a shared vocabulary about how we move through this system, how we navigate this system. There is some important words and verbiage and ideas that we need, some jargon, if you will, to make sure that we're all on the same page as we talk about navigating through the nervous system. What you see here are the navigational terms for the nervous system that will be important for us. They refer to orientations either relative to other structures or in the body as a whole. For example, dorsal is the back, right? So this is towards the back. You can think of like a dorsal fin on a dolphin, whereas ventral is towards the stomach. So dorsal and ventral are going to refer to towards the back or towards the stomach throughout the whole entire body. Anterior and posterior refer to the front or the rear. Maybe you've heard of the term posterior sometimes in reference to the bottom, right? So it's behind. Whereas things like superior and inferior are relative to other parts of the body, right? There isn't something that is superior or inferior in the body as a whole, but rather it's going to be relative to some other part of the nervous system. Lateral is away from the middle of the body towards the edges, whereas medial is towards the midline of the body. Proximal and distal are also relative to other structures, or in this case, origin points or attachment points. For example, your hand is going to be much more distal, say, to your elbow or your shoulder, right? Whereas the fingers are going to be more proximal to the hand. Ipsilateral and contralateral are important when we start talking about sides of the brain. Ipsilateral means that things are on the same side of the body, whereas contralateral means the opposite side. And then lastly, when we talk about neuroimaging, you're going to have to pay attention to the planes of dissection. If you can imagine, as we move through a brain, when we first started working with brains, we would have to, take them out of an animal or even a person, and then you would do them in slices. However you decide to slice that brain, that is the only way that brain can ever be sliced. You can't re-slice that brain. At that point, you're dicing it, and dicing it isn't terribly useful. So when you started to decide how you're going to slice the brain, you had to pick a particular plane. The planes are what we call coronal, which is moving from the anterior or the front of the brain towards the back, the posterior. Right? So we're going to move from the forehead to the back of the head. Whereas sagittal is a plane that moves from one side of the brain to the other side of the brain, passing through the medial line, whereas horizontal is moving from the inferior part of the brain up to the superior, from below to above. We'll see these here in just a second. Visually, hopefully it makes it a little easier. The dorsal and ventral can be a point of confusion, because these were defined based on the body, the back, and the stomach, and that works for the brain as well for most animals except for humans. Humans walk upright, and when we did that, our head actually transitioned and rotated 90 degrees relative to the rest of the body. All right, so if you look here, you'll see that the dorsal part of the dog, the back part of the dog, also matches the top of the head of the dog. And the stomach, the ventral part, is not only towards the stomach, but also towards the bottom. So in many animals, dorsal and ventral are going to refer to the top of the head or the bottom of the head. All right? And we kept that orientation for humans as well, but in this case, now we split it 90 degrees. All right? So it's no longer towards the stomach or towards the back. Right? Dorsal is now the top of the head, and ventral is towards the bottom of the head. And because of the orientation of the human skull, dorsal and ventral no longer refer to back and stomach when we're talking about the brain. Right? In order to do the more back to stomach, that's where we have the anterior and posterior. So dorsal is top, ventral is bottom when we are talking about the brain, and it is back and stomach when we're talking about the body. Or in the brain, anterior and posterior are going to refer more towards the stomach and the back. And here's a visual representation of the slides, the cuts of the brain, the planes of the brain, right? Remember, coronal is going to be from anterior to posterior, right? The sagittal is going to be from lateral to medial to lateral again, from one side through the midline to the other side. And then lastly, the horizontal is going to go from ventral to dorsal, from bottom to top. All right, so that is how we sort of describe the navigational approaches to the nervous system. Take some time to look at these vocabulary words, orient yourself to them, because they'll be quite helpful moving forwards.